Hello and welcome to Argus Media Politics of Energy 2024 podcast. My name is Hai Gugarat and I'm news editor at Argus Media.
And I'm Chris Knight. I'm a senior correspondent at Argus Media. We're both based in the Argus Washington office, and our job is to interpret U.S. energy policy and politics for our readers, and today our listeners here in the U.S. and abroad.
Today is October 24th, so the U.S. presidential and congressional election campaign will end in 12 days. Chris and I are not here to tell you who will win the elections, but we will talk to you about possible outcomes of the elections and how they will affect U.S. and global energy markets. And of course, just as a reminder, the presidential election features former President Donald Trump on the Republican side and Vice President Kamala Harris on the Democratic side. The House and the Senate are also being contested.
So, Heike, when I think about this race and energy issues, if you boil it down to a single thought, I think the impression is, among a lot of people, is that Donald Trump would be good for the oil and gas industry, Kamala Harris would be bad, but the realities are actually a lot more complicated. There's a lot more nuance and details that I think are pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's kind of surprising that a top energy policy issue in this campaign focused on what Harris said in a previous election cycle in 2019 when she promised to ban fracking. She's walked it back, but Trump keeps bringing it up. Can you tell us why this matters?
Yeah, so Harris adopted this position during the last presidential cycle at a time when Democrats were in a primary. Things were, it was sort of a race to be who could be the most progressive, who could take on the most ambitious climate agenda. And for Harris, that has come to be a bit of a liability because of her proposal or her promise that she said she would ban fracking if she was elected. She walked back that position as soon as she became the vice presidential nominee, and she reiterated that once she became the nominee a couple of months ago. But there's still a lot of attacks from Trump against her on this. Trump will say that she's being insincere, that if she is elected, she'll move forward and ban fracking, and that the oil and gas industry would be over, essentially. If you listen to what Harris has said, and if you look at how she's acted in office, I think it is pretty credible that she would not ban fracking. First of all, she doesn't even have that authority. It would require probably an act of Congress or some very creative and ambitious regulatory actions that I think would have a hard time standing up in court. So she doesn't have the authority to ban fracking. She's talked about how oil and gas production has gone up under her while she's been vice president. She's talked about how she doesn't want to be relying on foreign oil. So a lot of things she said has given signs that there would be basically a continuation of the Biden administration policies that have allowed oil and gas production to climb to record levels, around 13 million barrels a day, which is significantly more than they hit under Trump, about a million barrels a day more.
Of course, both candidates love to take credit for this record oil and gas production. And just like you, I've listened to a lot of Trump speeches, and of course, he regularly promises to cut energy prices in half within a year. Could he actually do that? And what would he need to do for that to happen?
Yeah, this is one of the campaign promises that strikes me as very hard for him to deliver. He says he's going to cut gasoline prices in half. So gasoline prices are close to $3 a gallon. So down to 150 is basically what he would have to have happen. Cut natural gas prices in half. Natural gas prices are already very low. A lot of people, a lot of producers in West Texas are having to sell at negative prices right now. And they're just doing that because they want to produce associated oil. Cutting electricity prices in half. How do you do that? The entire electrical system is this huge machine with people who have already made big investments. They're not going to just cut prices in half because of a change of federal policy. So could Trump do this? This would be a very heavy lift. I mean, federal oil and gas production is only about a quarter of the total production in the U.S. So let's say he opens up every federal land that exists to drilling. Um, let's say he opens up ANWR or all offshore oil and gas leases. Well, oil and gas companies plan on horizons that look 4 years, 6 years, 7 years. They don't have the workforce. They don't have the drilling rigs. They don't have just the raw steel available to. Trump has talked about if he was in office, the production would be 4 times higher. So there are ways that Trump could increase oil and gas production, but those things would take time. And if you just look at what he did in his first administration, he also adopted this idea that he wanted to increase oil and gas production. Under his administration, it did go up, but it didn't go up, it didn't double. The prices, I mean, the only way prices fall in half is if we had a repeat of the circumstances like we saw during the pandemic, where demand just collapsed and so did prices. And I don't think a lot of Americans would welcome a repeat of the pandemic or the market dynamics that occurred then that allowed oil prices to fall so much.
Sure. And has Harris actually offered any specific promises on reducing energy prices or the direction of U.S. oil and gas supply?
Yeah, Harris has been in a bit of a tricky spot because she doesn't want to. Everything is sort of revolves around Pennsylvania, which is one of the critical battleground states. So she's wanted to talk in a way that would not seem hostile to production there. She's said that for example, she said she signed the Inflation Reduction Act. She said that required an increase in fracking leases. There's no such thing as fracking leases, but it did require a lot of federal oil and gas lease sales to go forward. And just by virtue of the way industry works right now, most of those onshore federal lands do end up in fracking. So in a way, yeah, she has increased fracking by voting for that law and being the tie-breaking vote. She hasn't said anything concrete on I'm going to reduce prices by this much, but she has talked generally about keeping the cost of living low, making energy prices affordable, and broadly supporting clean energy as a way to make the U.S. less reliant on oil and gas and have other options.
So you and I are working in DC, and we get this targeted ads here on energy. And one issue that keeps coming up is pause that the Biden administration instituted earlier this year on licensing new LNG projects. And I guess the unspoken fear in the industry is that this LNG permitting pause would somehow be indefinite if Harris wins. How is the regulatory process going to work on this issue?
So just to break it down real quickly, in the U.S., LNG export projects go through a sort of a dual track permitting regime. An agency called FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, approves the construction, looks at the site, looks at environmental issues, and then the Department of Energy issues the export licenses. This allows you to actually send the gas overseas, send it over the border. What the Biden administration did earlier this year was it said it would pause licensing to new LNG export facilities while it did a study to look at issues such as climate change, whether LNG exports are a net negative or net positive for the climate. They also wanted to look at how approving more LNG export facilities would affect domestic natural gas prices. They say that study is ongoing and that it won't be final until the end of the first quarter, so March 2025, which is obviously going to be in the next administration. They want to do a public comment period, so I would anticipate they would actually release this study pretty soon, probably after the election, definitely, probably in December or January, and then there would be a public comment period. So how does this all shake out? How does this all resolve? Well, Trump has said that he would approve these LNG export licenses immediately once he gets back, if he's elected. So that would be good news for projects like Commonwealth LNG, CP2, Lake Charles LNG, an expansion project for Port Arthur LNG. All of these have been caught up in the licensing pause. Would he be able to do that legally? I guess it's difficult to guess how this would all shake out. But if the Biden administration releases this LNG study, it creates a paperwork trail, it creates a record that then DOE would have to deal with when it moves forward. It could say that, oh, that study was draft, we're not finalizing it, we're just going to move forward. It could do some other actions, but it would basically this study would be something that whatever the next administration does would need to take into consideration as it moves forward. If Harris takes office, she hasn't spoken at length or really that much at all that I can tell about LNG exports. But given the way that she's talked about energy, I think it's hard to imagine she would say LNG licensing is paused indefinitely forever. They would probably do something where they take a middle ground approach where they take more consideration of the climate issues, but still allow projects to go forward under certain circumstances.
Circling back to Trump's speeches, one impression I get is he really seems to dislike electric vehicles. And of course, electrification of transport is an issue that the oil industry is paying close attention to. And this is something that is being advanced under the Inflation Reduction Act that passed 2 years ago. Is it fair to say that the IRA's tax credits for EVs or for any other renewable energy technologies have a short shelf life if Trump wins?
This is the probably $1 million question or hundreds of billions of dollar question for everyone in the energy industry. Everyone is trying to figure out if Trump wins, which of these tax credits would be spared. The way the Inflation Reduction Act worked is it had tax credits for essentially every slice of the energy industry. EV tax credits to auto manufacturing tax credits, battery, solar, carbon capture, hydrogen. There's an incentive there for every industry to do something that was intended to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, intended to create new jobs. The EV tax credit specifically, Trump has seemed to direct a lot of his ire toward. He has criticized electric vehicles for being difficult to charge. He says they're so heavy that they're going to have to redesign every bridge in America, which is kind of an overstatement, that they catch on fire, that they are not reliable, that they don't go far enough, that the whole thing's a waste of money. And that he's wrapped this up in the idea that they're going to ban gasoline-powered cars, which is not really the case. So I think it's very fair to say that if Trump were in office, they would either try to revise the EV tax credit through legislation or throw sand in the gears by changing how that tax credit is implemented. You could do certain things about limiting how much material can come from abroad, from places like China, to determine which vehicles qualify as a way to basically make the tax credit less powerful. There's plenty of other tax credits that are in the IRA that people think could be safe, just because there's a lot of spending and investment in Republican-held districts that folks would be reluctant to see go away. But no one has any guaranteed assurances of which tax credits will survive, which ones would be repealed if Trump were in office.
So one issue that kept coming up in the last 4 years, and even before that, is permitting and regulation. And this is an issue our listeners care a lot about, and the whole energy industry does. And what they really want is predictability and faster timelines all across the energy sector spectrum. What are Harris and Trump saying about this issue?
Yeah, they want predictability, they want faster timelines, and they want litigation reform. Essentially, they want lawsuits to go either faster or have a narrower scope to go into certain courts and not others, just because there's been a lot of high-profile projects that have faced huge delays because of litigation. For example, the Mountain Valley Pipeline came in years delayed. It doubled in cost because of a series of lawsuits. There's also a couple of LNG projects that are being developed in South Texas that are caught up in a lawsuit that was recently decided by the DC Circuit that's currently on appeal. So the industry would love to have permitting reform go through. There's an effort right now in Congress, a bill proposed by Senator Joe Manchin and Senator John Barrasso that would expedite some permitting. It would allow electric transmission lines to move forward in some cases. It would allow more oil and gas leasing. Whether or not that legislation actually passes is an open question, but Trump or Harris both have talked about building things faster, about cutting red tape. During Trump's first term, he also wanted to expedite permitting, and what ended up happening is a bipartisan deal never really came together. Because of the way Congress works, a permitting bill really would need to be bipartisan, and there were a lot of false starts and sort of partisan ideas, and it just sort of fizzled out. So permitting will definitely be something that people are paying attention to and will continue to pay attention to, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of these clean energy projects are being held up in permitting and they're not moving fast enough. They need electric transmission lines to come forward. So there's incentives on both sides of the aisle for permitting to happen. It's just who can get that deal to come through. There's some things you can do by unilaterally just through regulation, but every energy industry executive trade group says that there needs to be more legislation on this issue. So I think I've run through a lot of the domestic side, Hike. I wanted to turn to you and talk to you about some foreign policy issues. Ukraine seems to be one foreign policy issue where Trump has promised the most drastic changes. So what would happen if he's elected there?
Indeed. So there are a few issues where Trump has been consistent and provided clear guidance, at least on the direction he will take. And this is one of them. And what Trump keeps saying is he will end the war in Ukraine. He will do a deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin. We don't quite know what that means, but the intent is clear on Trump's part. And there's also no doubt that whoever is president next year can affect the direction of the war, either by allowing Ukraine continued access to US weapons and economic aid, or by denying Ukraine with support and undermining its defense capacity. I would make the case that this issue has bigger potential impacts on global oil markets if Trump is elected than anything he tends to do with domestic policy changes, as you have already talked about. And the reason for that is this. The war in Ukraine has led to sanctions from the US, UK, and the EU that have rerouted Russian crude to China and India and to Turkey to some degree, and forced Russian refined products to find new markets in Asia and Latin America. At the same time, this has allowed US LNG to be exported to Europe in larger than ever volumes. In some months, Europe receives more US LNG than it imports Russian pipeline gas. So if Trump comes in and tries to do a deal with Russia that stops the war under whatever terms, that would undermine any support for this continuing sanctions regime in Europe. In the EU, sanctions against Russia have to be renewed every 6 months. In the past month, it has become more and more difficult to renew with sanctions as they come up for expiration. So if the US forces an end to the war, the question is what happens to the sanctions regime? Because the EU has every economic incentive to engage in deal making, just like Trump would. I'm not discussing the geopolitical or moral aspects of this. Just in market terms, the Russian supply and European demand are next to each other. And yes, the EU has gone out of its way to cut off reliance on Russian energy, but this is a huge sacrifice on the part of the European governments because their consumers are paying higher prices by cutting itself off from Russian oil and gas sources. On the other end of the spectrum, Harris has pledged to continue the current policy, and that means at the very least continuing the current sanctions regime. If the war drags on, we can expect the sanctions to be dialed up. Discussions about providing Ukraine with long-range strike capacity are underway, and we know that Ukraine has used its own military capacity to hit at Russian refineries. So this war is affecting energy infrastructure in the region already, and it will continue to affect global and oil gas markets, whoever is elected, but the potential impacts are larger if Trump is elected.
What is Trump saying about tariffs and how would that affect the energy sector?
Yeah, so tariffs are another issue. And in addition to China, I would say that Trump has been very consistent both on the campaign and, of course, during his own presidency. So we can speak about tariffs with greater certainty in terms of potential changes to policy. Trump can increase tariffs by executive action. He's mentioned tariffs of 10 or 20% on imports from all foreign countries, and even higher on China, up to 60%. So it's possible increase in tariffs and trade wars if Trump is elected. Have raised concerns in the energy industry because that would raise the cost of imported materials and possibly set off trade wars that would affect energy exports, as it already happened in 2018, 2019 when Trump was president. Just as a reminder, Trump tariffs on imported steel raised the cost of building pipelines and other infrastructure. China retaliated against US crude and LNG imports. It all ended with a phase one deal that China really never implemented. Now imagine this scenario applying to the rest of the world. The United States is a net gas and oil exporter, so this industry is very interested in maintaining free trade as it should be. The Peterson Institute for International Economics says that Trump tariffs in 2018-2019 were almost fully passed on to US consumers in form of higher prices. And just to put things in perspective, when Trump says he's going to impose tariffs on all US imports, that would mean taxing 10 times the amount of imports that he did in his first term. Of course, there are other effects. Oil demand growth runs parallel to economic growth. So a major trade war under Trump would have negative effects on the United States and the rest of the world. The IMF, in its latest World Energy Outlook this week, says that this potential hypothetical trade war that would involve the United States, Europe, and China would reduce US GDP annual growth by 0.5 percentage points in the next 5 years. Similar effects on the rest of the world. Now, let's turn to Harris. And I should say from the outset that both the Republicans and the Democrats have given up on free trade practices from 20 years ago. But there is still a difference. Under Biden, and we expect this to continue under Harris, tariff actions have been targeted mostly at China. The EU has resolved some differences with the EU under Biden, so a shared approach with climate should help resolve any impact when the EU implements its carbon border adjustment mechanism. With regard to China, the Democratic administration talks up what they call small yard, high fence, meaning tariffs and trade and investment restrictions in specific areas such as EVs and batteries, semiconductors, critical minerals, and renewable energy technology. One final note on trade. The USMCA treaty is due for a review in 2026. And if you remember how the United States, Canada, and Mexico negotiated this agreement 5 years ago, there was a lot of trade tensions. And of course, Mexico is a major destination for US exports of refined products and natural gas. U.S. energy industry, both under Trump and under Biden, complained of discriminatory treatment in Mexico. That dispute never got resolved under the USMCA because, of course, immigration dominates any other subject between the United States and Mexico. But we will expect an increase in tensions as this 2026 deadline approaches. That is true in both cases, if Trump is elected or if Harris is elected.
I guess I would just add on the tariff issue, Trump has said he'd do 100%, 200%, 1,000%, and now he's saying 2,000% tariffs on Chinese auto imports, which I think is fair to say 2,000% tariff would basically prevent all Chinese vehicles from reaching the U.S. Beyond tariffs, is there anything else to look out for in terms of China policy from either candidate?
Yeah, so as far as Trump is concerned, tariffs and China seem to go in tandem, but both candidates seem to agree on one thing, that China is the main challenge for the United States on a global scale, both in economics and geopolitics. How they promise to deal with that is different, of course. We've just talked about tariffs, so you can have a rough idea of what a second Trump presidency means for China. But there is not much possible upside for U.S.-China relations under a Harris presidency either. We can expect continued efforts to prevent an all-out escalation, but tensions accumulate over Taiwan, over U.S. alliances in Indo-Pacific, on global trade. Adding to that is the war in Ukraine, where the United States is trying to prevent direct Chinese help for the Russian war effort. One issue that I expect to keep coming up, whoever is elected, is the fact that China is the buyer of last resort of crude from countries that the United States has imposed sanctions on: Iran, Russia, Venezuela. This doesn't seem to be a central government decision, as in most cases, independent refiners in China are just opportunistically buying sanctioned crude, which is cheaper. Stopping this trade by sanction alone has proved impossible because targeting small players doesn't work, and going after major Chinese institutions, to set an example, can cause ripple effects on the US and global economy. Trump's advisors are specifically focused on Iran's efforts to continue exporting to China. And they promised to cut off his trade by going after Chinese buyers, the entire supply chain on that sanctioned trade route. Interestingly enough, Trump himself now seems to be saying that US sanctions are not that effective and that he's not a big believer in them. This is something that's definitely worth watching for any oil industry observer.
And I wanted to ask about the Middle East. That's going to be a top priority for whoever is elected, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, because the Middle East escalation in the next few months is going to feature prominently for the White House. And there is not much new to expect here under either candidate, but the one issue is how to manage the Iran aspect of that crisis. I mentioned already the Trump team of advisors always talks tough on Iran, and Trump himself talks tough about Iran, but the reality is the same as it was under his first presidency. When Tehran is pushed too hard, it retaliates against oil trade in its neighborhood. So the question is not whether Iran's current 1.5 million barrels a day of exports can be reduced by sanctions or by some sort of physical action. But how Iran will retaliate will also matter, and how that can be managed. This is a very risky scenario. The risks are to the downside, and it bears repeating that the Middle East is the world's largest oil-producing region. Even when the United States is a major producer itself and a net exporter of petroleum, the Middle East has an enormous pricing influence on global oil prices. So what happens here matters for any U.S. president. It matters for the U.S. consumers, of course.
All right, thank you, Hike. We'll keep on covering energy policy issues for the next 12 days as the election comes up, and then we will have a post-election webinar on November 12th. Our registration page for that webinar will be live next week, so follow Argus's social media accounts or our main website to get details for that. Thank you very much.